One of my favourite eras for vintage fashion is the 1930s. And while I have tackled some 1930s sewing projects, I haven't done a 1930s knitting project yet. But then, my friend Engineering Knits sent me a selection of incredible 1930s knitting magazines all the way from the USA. And there are many designs in there I'd love to make, hopefully, one day. The one that grabbed my eye, first of all, was this one, because I have never seen a pattern from this era made in chunky yarn. I very rarely do anything in super bulky weight. I absolutely love this design, so I just knew I had to give it a go.
This knitting magazine was published by the brand Fleischers, and this pattern is called Thrift Tea Slip-On number 1993. Catchy. It calls for 12mm, 14-inch long wooden needles, which I didn't have, so I bought myself a vintage plastic pair off of eBay, but I found these difficult to work with, as you shall see. As usual, substituting vintage yarn can be very tricky, but thankfully this pattern did include a reference for gauge, so I chose a modern yarn that was close enough. As yarn at this weight can be very expensive, I went for an option that was in the sale, which was this Drop Snow in the shade Grape. It's one of these roving yarns, so only a single ply, and I don't know how that compares to the structure of the original yarn, but it worked just fine for this somewhat experimental project. I cast on using the thumb method, as I usually do for vintage projects, as it was the most popular method at the time, or at least the one I've seen instructions in books for most often. Having cast on, I started on the rib, and straight away I began to struggle with the cumbersome nature of these massive needles. I think several things are going on here. Firstly, I rarely knit with anything heavier than 4-ply weight yarn, so I mostly use needles around the 3mm mark, so this just felt unfamiliar to me. But mostly, these plastic needles are so heavy, and as many of you know, I live with an energy-limiting condition, and it's difficult to explain to people just how fine the margins are when it comes to my body's ability to cope with things. But it turns out my hands and arms are just too weak to deal with the weight of these needles.
This is 12 rows and I'm already knackered. I mean, now I've got to increase. Ugh. So I've been chugging along on my Thrift Tea slip-on here. This did not take very long, which is the beautiful thing about working at this weight. You know, this is maybe like 25 rows or something stupid like that, and it's already 12 inches long. So I have to cast on for the arms, yes. And then we have to do a drop stitch or open work pattern for the yoke. So let's see if we can't tackle that together. So first of all, we're casting on 4 stitches. Interestingly, they describe that as casting on at the end of the purl row, which I suppose whether it's the end of the previous purl row or the beginning of the next knit row is a matter of opinion, really, isn't it? But then that does make the next bit confusing. Okay, so as long as we sort of end with the purl row, it should be fine. And then work 3 rows. I am becoming ever so slightly more accustomed to these massive needles, but I don't think I'm ever going to be able to knit elegantly with them. Maybe I should try parlour knitting. Do you know what? That's actually easier. Oh my gosh, I'm a genius. Modest too. Don't know if I've ever seen anybody do parlour style with the yarn in the left hand. The only thing I find about this is like, how do you hold it once you've got loads of stitches on the needle and the fabric coming off it, right? Like that maybe? Okay.
The drop stitch pattern involved wrapping the yarn twice around the needle when making a stitch, rather than the standard once.
As if this was needed to be more fiddly. Oh my god. Can't believe like loads of people recommend this for beginners. I suppose it grows quickly and so that you have a end product quickly, but like, this is just not pleasant. Purl 1 row, dropping the extra wraps. Interesting. So, oh my God. Oh, I see. Comme ça, right. If you can see that, we've now got a row of like extra long stitches.
I had to repeat the drop stitch pattern until 3 pattern rows had been completed, and then it was onto a garter stitch section for the yoke. The neck hole was made by casting off the central stitches, and then each half of the yoke was worked separately for the shoulders before joining on the other side of the neck for the rest of the sweater. This all-in-one T-shaped style was very common in the 20s and 30s.
So I'm now at this awkward stage where I've divided for the neck and I've knitted half of the yoke, and I have to cut my yarn and reattach it and finish off this side to match in garter stitch. Vintage patterns, this is the thing. On these last 16 stitches, knit 11 rows until ending at neck edge. Break yarn, that's what we've done. And then it says, join yarn at other shoulder and knit 12 rows. But as you can see, this half is right side facing up. So if I joined it at the shoulder, then I would end up with 2 consecutive right side rows. So they must mean to join it at the neck and knit 12 rows to end at the neck edge again, is what I'm assuming. Let's try it and see. Cast on 10 stitches at neck edge. 1, 2, 3.
Having cast on to complete the neck hole, I then carried on working the garter stitch yoke before starting the drop stitch pattern to match the back. Again, this was so fiddly. It was at this point that the realisation that this whole thing would have been much more manageable if I'd used 12mm circular needles struck me. But I was sort of going for historical accuracy in my construction methods, so the long, unwieldy needles it was.
302 rows on the front. Ah, I see.
Then the front basically mirrors the back, and so you cast off the stitches you cast on for the sleeves and work in stocking stitch until you reach the rib, where you decrease instead of increasing and work the rib to match. Then cast off, and it's time to pick up stitches for the sleeves. The sleeves are picked up along the garter stitch edge of the yoke and worked in a combination of stocking stitch and the drop stitch pattern. It was here that I ran into a little trouble with the sizing of the sleeves. The ribbed cuff was only 12 stitches, making it about 6 inches wide. Now, I don't know about you, but my upper arms are definitely not 6 inches in circumference. They're more like 30 centimetres than the 16 centimetres you see here. So I had to unpick the cuff and rework it, decreasing fewer stitches to get a ribbed cuff that would actually accommodate my bicep. Then, with the knitting complete, it was time to block the top. I left it to soak in some tepid water with a little bit of wool detergent, then rinsed the top thoroughly to get the detergent out. I've seen vintage instructions that say you should rinse your woolens at least 3 times, but I tend to do it until there are no bubbles and the water runs clear. I usually then put my knits in the washing machine to spin out the excess liquid as it gets more water out and saves a lot of energy on my part. But as this roving style yarn was already getting very fluffy just from the gentle rinsing it had had, I chose the old-fashioned method of wrapping it in a towel and squeezing out the liquid. This super bulky yarn held so much water that one towel wasn't enough to absorb it all, so I had to get another, and you can see just how much liquid was still coming through that second towel. So I got another towel and did the whole process again. I used this striped beach towel to pin out my knits because I don't have blocking mats, and the stripes of the towel are very handy for getting the knits pinned out evenly. I used these large-headed pins as it's easier to find them again, and pinned the top out to the right size and shape. There was no schematic or finished measurements for this design, so I just used my judgment and made sure the finished top would fit me. 3 days later, it still wasn't fully dry, so I took it off the towel and left it on a radiator for an afternoon, and then I could sew it up. I used a darning needle with the largest eye I could find to weave in the ends and sew up the top. This actually turned out to be really tricky to get to line up nicely, because the stitches are so large that there was hardly anything for the sewn stitches to grab onto, so you get loads of seam separation and things shift all over the place. I kind of just had to accept it wasn't ever going to look good and just go for it.
Just ignore that bit.
With the top sewn up, I could finally try on this most unusual of vintage patterns. Of course, the sun came out at precisely the wrong time and ruined my shot, so I retreated to the shade to show off the details of this thrift tee slip-on. I'm not sure I'm a fan. The bulky nature of the yarn looks kind of lumpy and has a tendency to ride up into folds that are Michelin Man-esque. The neckline hits weirdly. The instructions said to run a length of yarn or cord around the neck opening and gather it up, but that made it even worse, so I took it out again. Plus, the puff sleeves were, well, awful, frankly. Yes, I had to make the cuffs bigger to fit my arms through, and that meant they didn't stay in the puffed position as they were designed to. But I'm honestly glad of that, because I don't know what is going on with these sleeves, but it looks like I'm wearing the kind of inflatable armbands kids wear when learning to swim. But with the sleeves pushed down, I don't hate this top. I'm still not sure that bulky knits are my thing. What strikes me when I watch this footage back is how this top really emphasizes my bust, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. I do like this drop stitch pattern, but I think it's more successful on the yoke than the sleeves. The sleeves just look a bit like something's gone wrong with my tension. Also, I think I'm wearing it backwards. The 2 stripes are supposed to be the front and the 3 stripes the back, but as that is the only difference between front and back, it doesn't make much difference. Here you can see what I mean about the lumpiness, and it does have a tendency to ride up. I found that if I pose like this with both hands on my waist, the top looks great, but it doesn't really stay looking like that. And of course, no retro Claude video would be complete without the sitting down montage, so here we go. I tried again with the puff sleeves, but I think what makes them weird is the fact they're so far off the shoulder thanks to the yoke. Again, you can see more about how it rides up. So, as you can probably tell from my face, Mixed feelings about this one. It was fun and in some ways challenging for me to knit, but it won't become a wardrobe staple for me. I've had a go at grading this pattern to be more size inclusive if you'd like to give it a go yourself. It hasn't been tested, so it's available as a free Ravelry download, and please let me know how you get on. Also, I swear this bloody pigeon is trying to sabotage me. Every time I film in the garden, it shows up and starts noisily scoffing down birdseed. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.